I had a picture in my head of how retirement was supposed to go. My wife and I talked about it for years. We'd sell the house in Akron, move somewhere warmer, maybe a little place outside of Tucson where my brother-in-law had some land. We'd wake up slow, drink coffee on the porch, watch the sun come up over the desert. After 38 years of hauling freight and getting up before 4 in the morning, I figured we'd earned that. That's not what happened. What happened was that my daughter called me on a Tuesday afternoon in February, and her voice sounded strange from the first word. Not bad strange exactly. More like she was trying very hard to sound normal, while something behind her eyes was working something out. She said, "Dad, I have some news." I was sitting in the kitchen of the house I'd lived in for 22 years. The afternoon light was coming through the window the way it always did, landing on the same spot on the linoleum that it always did. Everything around me looked exactly the same as it had that morning. She said her husband had been offered a position in Seattle, a big one, the kind that doesn't come around twice. She said they were going to take it. She said they'd be moving in 6 weeks. I told her that was wonderful. I meant it. I still mean it. A man wants his kids to move towards something, not away from something. I was proud of her. What I didn't know, what she didn't mention on that call, or the next one, or the one after that, was what they planned to do with my wife. My wife had been living with them for 11 months by that point. She had a form of early-onset dementia that had moved faster than any of the doctors predicted. She needed help with her medication, with her meals, with knowing what day it was and where she was, and who was in the room with her. My daughter had taken her in when it became clear I couldn't manage it alone and still keep my part-time work at the parts warehouse, which we needed to keep the insurance going. It was supposed to be temporary. That's what everyone said. Temporary, until we figured out a longer-term plan. 11 months is a long time for temporary. When I finally got the full story, not from my daughter but from her husband, who called me 3 days after that first conversation, while my daughter was apparently out. I was standing in my driveway in the cold with my jacket half on, heading to my truck to go pick up milk and bread. My son-in-law said it in the kind of voice men use when they've rehearsed what they're going to say, but they haven't rehearsed how to feel while saying it. He said that the Seattle move was going to be a fresh start. He said their apartment there wouldn't have room for a live-in situation. He said he was sorry, he really was, but they needed to think about their own future. He said they were sure I'd be able to figure something out. He said, "I'm sure you understand." I stood in my driveway in the February cold, and I didn't say anything for a long moment. The neighbor's dog was barking somewhere down the street. I could see my breath. I said, "Where is she supposed to go?" He said they thought maybe a facility would be the right move at this point. I said, "You're moving in 6 weeks." He said, "Yes." I said, "And my wife has been living in your house for 11 months. He said yes, and he was sorry, and they really had appreciated everything, and they hoped I understood. I told him I needed to go. I sat in my truck in the driveway for a long time without starting it. The milk and bread could wait. Let me back up, because you need to understand what the months before this phone call looked like. My wife's name is Bev. Beverly on her driver's license and her medical forms, but nobody has called her that in 50 years. She grew up outside of Columbus, second of 4 kids. Father worked the line at a plant that made electrical components that went into things she never could figure out. She was the kind of woman who remembered every birthday and sent actual cards, the paper kind, and wrote something different in each one that made you feel like she'd been thinking about you specifically. She made a pot of soup every Sunday from whatever was in the refrigerator. She had a laugh that started low and built, and when something really got her going, you could hear it from the next room. The dementia started with small things, losing words mid-sentence, repeating a question she'd asked 10 minutes ago, stopping in the middle of a task like she'd suddenly forgotten the task existed. We had a good doctor. We had the right medications. For a while it felt manageable. We learned to move through our days differently, with more patience and more reminders and more grace for the hard moments. That's what you do. You adjust. But it accelerated in ways we weren't prepared for, and I'm not going to dress that up. There were nights I sat in the hallway outside our bedroom because she didn't know who I was, and it frightened her to have me in there. There were mornings I got her dressed for church when it was a Wednesday. There were trips to the grocery store I had to cut short because she became convinced something bad was happening, and nothing I said could reach her. My daughter lived 40 minutes away. She had a spare room. She'd been a nurse for 8 years before she stepped back from it to raise her kids, so she knew how to read a situation, and she knew how to keep someone calm. When she suggested that Bev come stay with them, at least for a while, I felt something in my chest loosen that I hadn't even realized was wound tight. I visited every Sunday, sometimes twice a week when I could manage it. Bev had good days and hard days. On the good days, she knew me right away, and we'd sit in the sunroom, and I'd hold her hand, and we'd watch the birds at the feeder my daughter had set up by the window. On the hard days, I'd sit across from her, and she'd look at me with polite confusion, the way you look at someone you feel like you should recognize but can't quite place. Both kinds of days were ours. I wasn't going to miss them. My son-in-law was pleasant enough. He worked in software, did well, kept the house very clean, had opinions about the right way to load a dishwasher that he was willing to share. He treated Bev fine, from what I could see. Not warmly exactly, but correctly. He did what was required. I should have paid more attention to what he didn't do. He never sat with her. In 11 months, every time I came over, he was somewhere else in the house. Working in his office, out for a run, in the kitchen, doing something that required his full attention. He was never rude about it, he just wasn't there. And when my daughter tried to include him in the harder conversations, what happens when she needs more care, what we do if her condition changes quickly, what the long-term picture looks like, he had a way of making those conversations end before they got anywhere. He'd get a phone call. He'd remember something he needed to check on. He'd listen just long enough to say something that sounded thoughtful without actually committing to anything. I noticed it. I didn't say anything. I told myself it wasn't my place, that they had their own dynamic, that some people show up differently, and that didn't mean they weren't showing up. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a lot of things. The 6 weeks went fast in the way that bad things always do when you're hoping they'll slow down. I made calls. I drove to 3 different facilities within 20 miles and walked through them with a notepad and asked questions and tried to imagine Bev in those hallways, in those rooms, eating in those dining areas with the fluorescent lights and the televisions mounted too high on the walls. One of them was fine. It was clean and the staff seemed kind, and the woman who gave me the tour had been there for 14 years, which I took as a good sign. The problem was the cost. I won't get into all of it, but here is the short version. Medicare covers some things and not others, and the things it doesn't cover are often the things that make the difference between a place that feels like care and a place that feels like storage. The facility that seemed right was going to cost more per month than my mortgage. And I was 63 years old with a pension that was steady but not designed for this, and savings that had taken a hit a few years back from a car accident that wasn't my fault, but that cost more to sort out than I ever expected. I called my daughter. She was stressed and short with me in a way she rarely was, and I understood. She had a move to manage and 2 kids and a husband who had apparently already made his peace with all of this while she was still trying to catch up to what was happening. I didn't make it harder for her. That's not who I want to be. But I did ask her directly whether she and her husband had considered contributing to the facility costs, whether that was something they'd talked about. She was quiet for a moment. She said her husband felt like they'd already given a lot by hosting Bev for almost a year. I said I understood. I said goodbye and hung up and went and sat on the back steps of my house for a while. The thing about a long marriage is that you develop a sense of what your partner would say in any given situation. You've been through enough that you can hear their voice when they're not in the room. And sitting there on those steps in the cold, I could hear Bev, the Bev of 10 years ago, the Bev who still had all her words. And what she was saying was the same thing she always said when something was unfair, and I was inclined to let it go. She'd say, "You're allowed to be upset about this." She was always better at that than I was. 3 days before my daughter's moving truck was scheduled to arrive, I drove over to pick Bev up. My daughter had helped me set up the second bedroom. We'd moved some things around, got a baby monitor so I could hear her in the night, put up a few photographs she recognized. It wasn't a plan. It was a next step. Sometimes that's all you get. My son-in-law was home when I arrived. He helped me carry Bev's things out to the car with the efficiency of a man completing a task he's glad to be completing. He shook my hand at the end. He said, "We really do wish you both the best." I looked at him for a moment. He had his hand still extended, and his expression was pleasant and finished. The way people look when they've moved on from something even while the thing is still standing in front of them. I said, "Do you?" He didn't say anything. I said, "She remembered your birthday last year. She asked my daughter 3 times what you'd want because she wanted to get it right. She bought you a book about fly fishing because she thought it was something you'd mentioned once." I paused. "Did you know that?" He said he remembered the book. I said, "She wrapped it herself." That was a hard day for her, the wrapping, but she did it. I didn't say anything else. I went around to the passenger side and helped Bev into her seat and put her seat belt on and closed the door. I got in on my side. I backed down the driveway. My son-in-law was still standing there when I pulled onto the street. I didn't look back after that. The first few weeks were hard in the way that any new arrangement is hard. I had to relearn her rhythm. The morning was usually the best. She was often clearest in the morning, and we'd have breakfast together. And sometimes she'd be sharp enough to make small jokes, the dry kind she'd always made. And those moments were like finding money in an old coat. You didn't expect them, you were just glad. Afternoons were harder. She'd get restless and confused, and sometimes she'd ask for people who weren't there. Her mother, a childhood friend, a dog we'd had for 12 years that had died a decade ago. I'd learned not to correct her on those things, just to sit with her in whatever she was experiencing, just to keep my voice steady. I got help where I could. There was a home health aide who came 3 mornings a week through a program I didn't know about until a social worker at the hospital mentioned it. A neighbor down the street, a retired teacher named Agnes, 71, whose own husband had gone through something similar, started coming by on Sunday afternoons to sit with Bev so I could get out for a few hours. She didn't ask for anything in return. She just showed up. People like that exist. I want you to know that. When things go wrong, and the people you expected to show up don't, there are usually people you didn't expect who do. That has been true every time in my life that it's mattered. My daughter called about 2 months after the move. She'd gotten settled in Seattle, the kids were in their new school, things were coming together. She sounded like herself again, lighter, less like someone carrying something they couldn't set down. She asked how Bev was. We talked for a long time. She cried a little. I didn't hold it against her. She'd done more than most people would have and less than I'd needed, and both of those things can be true at the same time. What she said, near the end of the call, was that she wished she'd pushed back on her husband sooner. She said she'd known something was wrong with the way he'd been handling it, or not handling it, but she hadn't wanted the argument. She'd told herself it would work out somehow. I told her the same thing I'd told her when she was 22, and made a decision that cost her something she cared about. I told her that we don't always get to know the right thing in the moment. Sometimes we only know it after. She said, "Are you mad at me?" I said I wasn't, and I meant that too. She asks about her mother. I tell her the truth, even when the truth is hard. She's been looking into what the costs would look like if she and her husband contributed something each month toward in-home care. She brought it up herself. Her husband apparently didn't object. I didn't ask what changed his mind. I don't need to know. Here is what I want to say, if you'll let me say it plainly. I am 63 years old. I've worked since I was 16. I've buried a father and a mother and a brother, and 2 friends who left too early, and I've watched my wife disappear in increments from the woman she was, and none of that has made me bitter, though I'll admit there are mornings where the grief is close to the surface, and it takes a minute before I can be useful. What made me angry, and I'm still sorting through it, wasn't the move. People move. People make decisions that serve their own lives. I understand that. I don't expect my daughter's husband to be a saint. I don't expect anything from him, if I'm honest. What made me angry was the way it was handled. The assumption that I'd figure something out. The handshake at the end like we'd completed a transaction. The 11 months of Bev being there, woven into their daily life, and then the 6 weeks' notice, and then the efficiency with which it was all unwound. The book about fly fishing. She remembered his birthday. She wrapped that gift herself. And when she needed somewhere to sleep, when she needed people around her who knew her name and her face and what her laugh used to sound like, the door was closed. I don't think my son-in-law is a villain. I think he's a man who found it easier to look away than to look at something hard, and who is probably going to spend some years not quite understanding why there are things his wife can't forgive him for. That's its own kind of consequence. I didn't need to arrange it. It was already built into what he'd done. Bev has been back in this house for almost 5 months now. This morning she woke up and she knew me right away. That doesn't always happen, so when it does I try not to react to it too much. I've learned that if I get too bright or too eager about a good moment, it startles her, like a dog that's been mistreated learning to flinch at enthusiasm. So I just said good morning and asked if she wanted eggs. She said she wanted the kind with the cheese in them, scrambled with the cheese folded in, which is how I've been making them for 30 years. I made them. We sat at the kitchen table. The morning light came through the window and landed on the same spot on the linoleum that it always has. She looked out the window for a while, and then she looked at me and she said, "We're home." I said, "Yes." I said, "That's exactly right, we're home." She nodded and went back to her eggs. I kept my face neutral until I could manage it, and then I got up to refill my coffee so she wouldn't see. There are things in this life that break you open in ways you don't have a word for. That was one of them. Not a sad, kind of broken open. The other kind, the kind where you understand somewhere below the thinking part of your brain that this is it. This is the whole of it. The coffee and the eggs and the light on the floor and this woman across the table who doesn't always know my name but knew this morning and said we're home like she'd been waiting to say it. I'm not sure what I expected retirement to look like. I had a picture, and the picture was wrong. But I'm here. She's here. Agnes comes on Sundays. My daughter calls, and the eggs are exactly right.